Good morning, everybody. We'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to Maranatha Baptist Church this morning. Go ahead and turn to Esther. The book of Esther is where we're going to be today. Get situated here. So let's open up in a word of prayer, if you would, and be thinking in mind those that are in the path of this hurricane. Hopefully we won't see much here, but we'll see how that goes. But definitely keep folks in prayer this week. When you got a pandemic going on, it's a little difficult to think about other disasters happening. So let's open up in a word of prayer and we'll get started. Heavenly Father, we want to thank you for this time together. Thank you for the chance to gather and open up your word, Lord, and just to be able to realize the relevancy of your word, Lord, and how you've inspired this word and it still teaches us today, Lord, and we're able to glean lessons from your word that just can encourage our hearts and give us guidance in times that we don't understand. And I just thank you for your wisdom, your guidance through all this, Lord. I thank you for your words, and I just pray that you just help us as we open this today. Just help us to see what you'd have us see, and help us to be able to be ready for the services today and the messages that you have for us. And we just thank you for the time together. In Jesus we pray. Amen. All right, Esther. And I think, so this has been a little bit out of order because I had to stay out for a couple days or a weekend with my own coronavirus scare in my office. So I didn't want to bring that around here. So that's why we were a little bit out of order, but I'm glad to be able to bring this to you. So this is actually lesson 10 if you were following along in your notes as we go through. I will promise you, because I had the extra time, this lesson may be a little bit long. So I've been able to study a little bit more, so we may not be out as early as we have been, but hopefully you'll get something meaningful out of this. I will say when I started studying the book of Esther, the phrase that has jumped out is Esther chapter 4 and verse 14. And you're going to hear this phrase kind of throughout. We're going to start and end with this phrase because I think it's as relevant today as it was back in Esther's day. But it's the idea that in verse 14, where Mordecai is talking to Esther, and at the very end he says, "Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" We think about the times we're in and the challenges we face, and we'll talk about that in a minute, some of the uncertainties that are out there. You know, God has placed us in this time for this, right? He's put us in a place for a reason. There's no accident that 2020 has been the way it has and the challenges it's had. God's put us here for a reason. We'll look at that theme through here as we look at Esther. But as a part of an introduction, let's look at a few of the characters in this story, but the people that lived in that day, and kind of put it into context. And these are not obviously their pictures or photographs. I just use these as representation as we go through to put it in context of who these people are. There's four main people in this story. There's Esther, obviously, Ahasuerus, Mordecai, and Haman. So let's start by looking at Ahasuerus. And so we look at Ahasuerus, we see that Ahasuerus was the ruler of the Persian Empire. He's often believed to be Xerxes the First. And Ahasuerus is a term kind of like Pharaoh. It's the idea that he was the men of men. He was the king of kings of the empire. He was the ruler of the Persian Empire. You imagine and some scholars estimate it'd be like being the ruler of almost a third of all the world, of the known civilization. He was a man of power. The Bible describes his empire running from India to Ethiopia. The idea that it stretched this huge area, and its capital was Susa, here in modern day Iran. And we see in Esther, chapter 1 and verse 3, it says, "In the third year of his reign, he made a feast unto all his princes and servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of the provinces, being before him, when he eschewed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days." I mean, those verses should give you an idea of who he was. I mean, he wasn't just a powerful man. He was a man that showed off his glorious kingdom and his excellent majesty for 180 days, almost half a year. He had a celebration just to recognize how powerful he was. He pulled all the princes and the kings together for this celebration. And we know what happens in that celebration. He ends up asking his wife to come out after they'd been partying and wanted to make a show of her, and she refused, and he ends up exiling her and banning her. And so we know that Ahasuerus was a powerful man. What else do we know about Ahasuerus and how he ruled? We'll look at this a little bit later. How did he rule? Absolutely, right? He had to hold out his scepter. We'll look at this later. If you entered into the inner court, if he didn't hold out his scepter, what would happen to you? You'd be dead, right? So we talk about a man not just with wealth and power, but just his own intentions would determine your life or your death. And so Ahasuerus was a powerful man. We also see our next person in this story, which we know the book is named after, is Esther. Esther chapter 2, you can turn there. In verse 7. It says, and he brought up, and this is talking about Mordecai. It says, and he brought up Hadassah, that is Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father or mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. And so who do we know who Esther is? Who was Esther here? She was an orphan, right? So imagine this first contrast we see. Who was Ahasuerus? The strongest man in the world, most powerful man in the world. And who was Esther? An orphan who had to be raised by her, who did it say? Her, I never can get this right, his uncle's daughter. So had to be raised by his uncle, or his, however that is, cousin, somebody, family member. But that's how, she didn't even have next of kin to take care of her. I mean, she had to be cared for by somebody else. But he raised her as his own daughter because she had no father and mother. In verse 17, I'm kind of giving you the summary here of who she was. We see that she, through the story, through the events that occurred, we see in verse 17, it says, and the king loved Esther above all women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So here we see, and I'm giving you the quick summary, because again, these lessons don't get into all the history and everything, but the idea that Esther goes from being, an orphaned person who didn't have any family to take care of her, to being the most beautiful woman in the country. That the king is going to bestow the queenship on above anybody else. And so we see that her story is, it's an impressive one. And usually we put ourselves in Esther's shoes, right? We usually look to be that hero in the story. And we'll talk about that in a minute. We also see that there's Mordecai. Who is Mordecai? Go back to chapter 2 and verse 5. It says, now in Shushan, the palace, there was a certain Jew whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimea, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Jeconiah, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. So who was Mordecai? Mordecai was an exiled Jew. We said he was a Jew that had been carried away. It says when? It says when the captivity of Jeconiah, the king of Judah, which I'm not a Bible scholar, so don't try to check me on dates, but what I can pick up was that's about 597 BC is when Jeconiah was deposed by the Babylonians, and we see that Mordecai, guessing, he was carried away around then. And then we see the first return was Cyrus back in 538 BC, and then Xerxes began to reign in 486. So just to give you an idea of when we're at. So we're talking about Mordecai now and is in Shushan, in the palace, around the 480s, the 450 or 470s of BC. And so that means he's been living in exile for over 50 years. We imagine he may have been carried away as a child. It talks about his family there, them being carried away. And so that he'd been living in this exile for over 50 years. Almost 80 years. But the idea that they could have returned to Israel back in the early 500 BCs, but he's continued to live in Shushan for over 50 years. So keep that in mind, that this is a Jewish person that's living outside of Jerusalem. He's living in the capital of the Persian Empire. He's living here, and we'll talk about it in a minute. He's not just living there, but he's actually leading there. So go ahead and turn. We look down in chapter 2, verse 21. It says, in those days, while Mordecai sat in the gate, two of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh of those which keep the door were wroth, and sought to lay hands on the king Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it to Esther the queen, and Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when the inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged in a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king. So here's Mordecai, and where is he? Where's his position in the palace? It's not a trick question. It's in the first line. Where was he? In the king's gate, right? What was the king's gate? It was a position of power. Look at Daniel. No, you don't have to turn there. I gave you the verse here. But Daniel chapter 2 and verse 48 and 49. It says, then Daniel requested of the... actually, we can turn there if you want. Because I put 2 verses and I only put 1 up there. So that meant I wanted you to turn there. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 48 and 49. And it says, then the king made Daniel a great man and gave him many gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, chief of the governors over all the wise men in Babylon. And this is after Daniel has gone and given Nebuchadnezzar the message that he was supposed to give him. And Nebuchadnezzar in verse 47, it says, it is of truth that our God, that your God is a God of gods and a Lord of lords and or Lord of kings and a revealer of secrets. And so then he gives Daniel these gifts and makes him ruler of the whole province. But look what Daniel chose. It says, then Daniel requested of the king that he set Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel sat in the gate of the king. So Daniel had opportunity to be a ruler. If we kind of put it in context, he got a chance to be governor, but he chose to be attorney general instead because he liked the law. Daniel liked that role. And so Daniel chose to sit in the gate of the king. And that idea of the gate was a place where judgment was made. He was a judge, basically. And that's what Mordecai's role was in Shushan. And so imagine him sitting here in a place of authority. And that's actually what Bigthan and Teresh were jealous about. How would they put this guy in charge? How does this guy get to be sitting in the gate when we have to watch the door? Like that's where their jealousy came from. And so we see that would happen to them because of their jealousy. And Mordecai was the one that found out that secret and revealed that to Esther. And that we'll go through the whole story, but that's where Mordecai gets reward for that later on. And let's look at our last person in this story, Haman. Anybody ever watched a movie or seen Haman portrayed anywhere visually, like in a book, maybe even in our kids' papers that they get when they show Haman? What does Haman usually look like? Prideful. If he was a cowboy, what color hat would he have on? Big black hat, right? Usually when we have the villain in the story, we dress him in black, and he looks evil and scowling, and he's got hair and all over the place, and that's what we think of Haman, this Agagite. He's this rough, tough guy. But let's look at where Haman's story starts. Actually, go back to Exodus chapter 17, because sometimes we glance over these terms, like, oh, he's an Agagite. I don't know how to say that. Rachel said I got to be careful I don't add extra ags in there or G's, but. He's an Agagite. And what does that mean? That means he was related to Agag. So go back to Exodus chapter 17. We'll look at where Agag came from. Verse 8 and 9, it says, Then came Amalek and fought with Israel and Rephidim. So the Israelites are in the wilderness. They've just gotten water from the rock, and then show up Amalek and his group fighting against Israel. And Moses said unto Joshua, choose us out men, and go out and fight with Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. And we know how that story goes about raising up Moses' hands, and as his hands fell, the Amaleks prevailed, and as his hands were raised up, the Israelites prevailed. So who was Amalek? Amalek was the grandson of Esau. And so here we have Amalek. Go down to verse 16. Did I say 16? Yep. So for he said, because the Lord hath sworn because the Lord has sworn that the Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. God basically put a curse upon Amalek that there was going to be a tension a conflict between Israel and Amalek. Why? Because Amalek had attacked them in the wilderness in a vulnerable spot. Amalek had come upon them. And Amalek was, if you imagine, this is the distant cousin of Israel, right? These are Esau's folks. So we have Jacob's line and we have Esau's line. So these are relatives in some ways, but came and fought against them. And that wasn't just like, hey, they threw rocks at each other. They came to kill them. They came to loot and steal and rob. And so we see the Israelites here, that there's going to be a conflict between them. And God said this in verse 16. So when we get to Haman, we're actually seeing prophecy continued, right? Because God had given this curse upon the Amaleks. So go ahead and turn to our next passage. Go to 1 Samuel. 1 Samuel, verse 15. 1 Samuel, verse 15, we see that Agag was actually a descendant of Amalek. If I can get there too. Actually, look back look in verse 8 and verse 7. And Saul smote the Amalekites from Havilah until they comest to Shur, that is over against Egypt. And he took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive, and utterly destroyed all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag, and the best of the sheep, and the oxen, and the fatlings, and the lambs, and that which is good, and would not utterly destroy them. But everything that was vile and refuse, that they destroyed utterly. So here we have the idea of the Agagites. Who are the Agagites? They're followers of Agag, right? Agag was the king. And so we see that Agag was here. And what did Saul do? Saul was supposed to get rid of the Amalekites, to end this conflict, basically, that had been going on since the Israelite was wandering in the wilderness. And Saul chose to keep Agag on all the good stuff. And Samuel comes to him and convicts him for it and says, look, I hear sheep out in the field. Why do I hear that? And he says, or oxen in the field. And he says, because I spared the good stuff. And then Samuel ends up taking the life of Agag. But here we have the Amalekites and Agag continuing in this conflict. So Agag, what happened to Agag? Agag died, right? But somewhere, and we know through Esther, an Agagite survived, right? He may have been gone away somewhere in a distant land, but somewhere an Agag survived. What happened when when Agag's descendants survived? What do you think happened over these many years? Bitterness, anger, revenge, right? You imagine from generation to generation, there's been passed down this revenge and waiting for an opportunity to take revenge against the Jewish people, because there has been this conflict from the time that Israel was in the wilderness until we see this time that they were in the Persian Empire. So go ahead and turn back to Esther. And I want to put this context, because sometimes we just think of Haman as the bad guy, the guy with the black cowboy hat that walks in and is just being mean to everybody. No, Haman had a history here. Haman was a person whose culture and history has been shaped by this hatred for the Israelites, is this underlying mistrust and concern. And so we see in Esther chapter 1, now it's in the days of Ahasuerus. There's Ahasuerus, chapter 3. I'm reading 1:1. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. So what was Haman's position at this time? Second in command. He was put over he was what? He advanced him and set him a seat above all the princes that were with him. Haman was the highest prince. It's interesting. Think of who Haman was. And you can imagine, we can make a whole story about how Haman got to that position. Was Haman from a wealthy people, a wealthy family? No. Where was Haman's story? From a people that had been obliterated by the Israelites, a people that were despised. You imagine this. So Haman is somebody who was raised up through the ranks. He's worked his way up to get to be the second in the Persian Empire. He was not just some guy. Haman knew how to play the game, put it that way. And Haman knew how to make his way in that political world. And so here we have Haman, second in command. Well, there was an incident that occurred. And we see that Mordecai, further down in chapter 3, at the beginning there, Mordecai didn't bow down to Haman in his current state. He didn't acknowledge Haman in his high position. And in verse 6, it says, when Haman saw that Mordecai bowed not, nor did reverence him, was Haman full of wrath. And he thought scorn to lay hands on Mordecai alone, for he had showed him the people of Mordecai. Wherefore Haman sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. So we see that Haman's bitterness was, his cultural bitterness, we'll blame it on that, has been raised up, right? It says in there, he had shown him the people of Mordecai. Haman took an assumption about Mordecai. And I don't know all the story, the exchange that happened as he passed Mordecai. Mordecai says, I'm not going to bow because I'm Jewish and I can't bow to an Agagite. I don't know. But here we have this interaction that Mordecai is now blaming the entire Jewish people. Haman is now blaming the entire Jewish people for something Mordecai did. So we see the place that we're in before we even get to getting rid of the Jewish people, that there's some deep-seated issues here. And it says so that he wanted to destroy all the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. So we see in verse 8, Haman goes to Ahasuerus, and he said to the king Ahasuerus, there's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces and kingdoms, and their laws are diverse from all people, neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it please the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver to the hands of those that have charge of the business to bring it into the king's treasuries. What was Haman's response? He went to the king. How did he frame it when he went to the king? Did he say, you know what, we've had problems with the Jews all along, let's go take care of them? No, what did he say? He sowed distrust. What did he say? There's a certain people. And I highlighted that phrase because sometimes we will see people and we will think, I don't know them. Their ways are different than me. Their culture is different than me. I can't trust them. And that's what Haman was sowing. Haman was sowing that distrust among the king. I don't think the king really knew the Jewish people. Based on, he was taking Haman's word, right? Haman knew that you're from that area, right, Haman? You grew up in that area. You've dealt with the Jewish people all along. And he says what? And their laws are diverse from all people. They're not like us, king. They're just different. We can't trust them. We think about in our history, going back in time, about how that lie has been given again and again of cultures. I was reading a story the other day about World War II and the internment camps that we did for Japanese Americans because we didn't trust them. Their ways aren't like us. Let's go put them away because we can't trust them. Yet many Japanese fought and died for us in our country. And that's the idea we see with Haman here. Haman's like, we can't trust them. And what did he do? He created a law. He went to the king and said, let's create a law. Let's get rid of them all. Let's just utterly destroy them. So let's go ahead and actually get to the lessons. And now you see who the people are. And I want you to think about, who are you in this story? Sometimes we can be people in positions of power. Sometimes we can be people of influence or encouragement, like Mordecai. Sometimes we can be people who have to take courageous steps, like Esther. And sometimes we may be like Haman. We may have bitterness. We may have distrust. We may have something that our pride gets in the way. And so as we listen to this kind of look at Esther in a little bit more detail, I want you to think about, who are you in this story? How are you living your life in this story and the times we have today? So let's put it in context. What was happening? Oops, sorry, I didn't forward that. What was happening in that time? They estimate over 155,000 Jewish people were displaced out of Jerusalem and taken in through Babylon and out through Media. So here we have the Israelites displaced and scattered. A chance for some of them to move back. Remember, we talked about that when Cyrus was ruler, he allowed some to return, to start to rebuild, but some were still living in exile across the kingdom of Persia. That would be a tough time. Imagine as a people, if and I was trying to think of how to describe this, but imagine, and I won't label countries, but imagine a country comes in, conquers America, and says, we're going to ship you out, and you're going to go work in our factories, you're going to go in all these places wherever around the world, and you're not allowed to return for 50 years, or 70 years, 80 years. And then when you are allowed to return, what do? You've made a life, your cultures, you're all over the place. That's the time that the Israelites were living in. They were scattered abroad. We think of the times today, and as we go through this and we talk about the times then, I'm going to look at times today because I want you to put it in context. This time of Esther wasn't it was a distant time for us. We talk about BC. I have a hard enough time trying to remember how to count in BC because it goes backwards. Much less put it in context of really what that's like. But I want you to think about today and what that looks like. So just as an example, and it's an estimate that almost 80 million people are displaced today from conflicts, from famines, whatever it is, that are living outside of where their home is, where they grew up, where their people are from. The idea that over 80 million people are displaced for a variety of reasons, just trying to make it. And imagine this is what the Israelites were. I don't blame Mordecai for sitting in the gates of a Persian king. He was doing the right thing. He was judging. He was probably one of the best judges, and that's why some of the Persians didn't like that he was doing that. But Mordecai was making his life and caring for his family in a place that wasn't home. And so this is where the Israelites were. They were facing tough times. They were facing an uncertain future. In Esther chapter 3 and verse 8, what happens? Mordecai says, let's get rid of this certain people. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. If it pleases the king, let it be written that they may be destroyed. There was a law in the land that says, in a few coming up, you're all going to be destroyed. Can you imagine what that would be like? If someone says there's now a law that everybody that has blue eyes is going to be destroyed because we don't want blue-eyed people anymore. Like that's the reality of what they were facing as Israelites for nothing that they had done. They hadn't caused a rebellion. They hadn't tried to overthrow the king, but for some reason the king had made a law that they were going to be destroyed. It was an uncertain time for them. Where would you go? How big was King Ahasuerus' kingdom? What do we say? It's about a third of the known world. So where would you go if a third of the known world was out to kill you? Like this is where the Israelites were. The third of the known world had an order that they would have to kill them. So where do you go? So their world was uncertain. So as I thought about that, and I thought about, we don't have anybody saying let's you can't go anywhere, but I thought of all the things that create our uncertain futures. We think we were talking about 2020 and this year and all the things that have happened this year and the uncertainty that's happened. And I think of all the things, whether it's pandemics or political turmoils or economic challenges, cultural strifes, religious bias, whatever it is, there is challenges that create an uncertain future for us as believers, right? We're living in a world that's uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen next, but there's some uncertainty there. But we do know that God has given us some encouragement in His Word. So God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth be removed and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea. Though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof, Selah. The idea that God is our refuge and strength through this all. So it doesn't matter. What's it say there? Though the earth be removed and the mountains carried into the midst of the sea. The very earth, the foundation of the world be shaken. What do we have a comfort in? What? He is our very present help in trouble, right? No matter what we face, no matter what in that uncertain future. What else did they face? They faced an unapproachable king. We mentioned this earlier, the king in verse 4, verse 11. He says there, and all the king's servants and the people of the king's province do know that whether man or woman shall come into the king, unto the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such of whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live. But I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. So this is Esther telling Mordecai the challenge that Esther hadn't been called. But what was the king's law? That if he didn't hold out his scepter, it was a death sentence. So imagine this is the ruler of the people who's created a law that's going to destroy your people. So what do? You talk about open government, or there was no democracy here. There was no access to a ruler to make a decision. This king was unapproachable in the greatest sense. That just at a whim for that day, he may decide that he didn't want to see you, and what would happen? It would be death. And so this is what Esther was facing. And I think of our own kind of, do we have an approachable king? We don't have a king today, but we do have three. You could almost say three kings. in our White House, our Congress, and our Supreme Court? How many people feel that they're approachable? Well, according to, and I'll point out the date in here, September 19th, a Gallup poll said 60% of Americans have little or no trust in their federal government to solve any domestic problems. Think about that. 2/3 of our country don't feel that our government can solve domestic problems, and this was before 2020 even started. So how approachable is our king? I was telling Rachel, I said, I don't think we'd get put to death if we saw the president or the Congress, but if I ran up to the White House and jumped the fence, what would happen to me? Yeah, it wouldn't be good, right? It would hurt at least, probably. And I've been up there in D.C. for a conference once. It was in December. We saw folks going into, I think it was the West Gate, or West entrance, and it was in the evening, and we walked up and actually talked to the guard and said, what's going on? He says, oh, it's the White House party. And we're like, oh, can we get in? Like, is this possible to get in? But we didn't try it because I didn't want to find out how unapproachable the king was. But the idea being as believers, this can be a discouraging time, right? We can't reach out to our elected officials to make decisions that are right. We can try, right? I've had a chance to walk and talk to our congressman before in the Capitol Hill. It's an interesting experience. People waiting and trying to talk to their congressman. But there's an unapproachableness, right? We think about that, but that's not where we need to put our trust, right? It's not in whether we can approach the king or not. What's it say? Psalms chapter 146, put not your trust in princes, nor in the sons of man, in whom there is no help. His breath goeth forth, and he returneth to the earth, and that very day his thoughts perish. The idea we put our trust in politicians or princes, what's he say there? That very day his thoughts perish. How many issues do you think our elected officials see every day? Hundreds of everybody's issues, letters and so forth. He says, you know what? You're going to be put out of their mind. Don't put your trust in that. Doesn't mean you give up on democracy, but you don't put your trust in that. Where do you put your trust? He says, happy is he that the God of Jacob for his help, whose hope is in the Lord his God. We hope in God to solve these issues. We hope in God to give us the wisdom and to give our leaders wisdom in these issues. But we certainly don't have an approachable king when we see laws that are unjust or laws that are not just hurting believers, but are just that are unjust in this world. So let's look at Esther. We start to think of her tender traits that she shows. When I think of tenderness, and we think of how we should operate as believers when it comes to seeing things that are wrong or seeing things that we should have an impact on, I think of Luke chapter 10. You can turn there real quick. We won't read the whole chapter. But Luke chapter 10. And this is right after Jesus was sharing, we'll actually start in verse 25. And a certain lawyer stood up, and he tempted him, saying, Master, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? And he said unto him, what is written in the law? How readest thou? And he answered, saying, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength, with all thy mind, and thy neighbor as thyself. And he said unto him, Thou hast answered right. This do, and thou shalt live. But he, willing to justify himself unto Jesus, and who said unto Jesus, and who is my neighbor? And what was his answer? So Jesus gives him the story of the Good Samaritan. And down in verse 33, we said, But a certain Samaritan, as he journeyed, came there where he was. And he saw him and had compassion on him. And he went to him and he bound up his wounds, pouring in oil and wine, and set on him his own beast, and brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And on the morrow when he departed, he took out 2 pence and gave him to the host, and said unto him, Take care of him, and whatsoever thou spendest more, and more, when I come again, I will repay thee. Which now of these 3 thinkest thou was the neighbor unto him that fell into the thieves? God has given us a charge, right? We've talked about this in Sunday School quite a bit before, about what's the 2 major commandments? Love God and what? Love your neighbor. And so we think about the idea of tenderness. Tenderness isn't about me, right? Tenderness is about how I view others and how I care about others. We think about a mother and a father. Traditionally, dads aren't as tender as mothers are, unless it's, I know some dads will cry. I know I will cry easily when I see my kid hurt. I try not, you suck it up, and then you go later on, oh man, that was tough. But the idea of tenderness, that's not typically, it's not about how I feel. It's about how I feel when I see someone else, right? It's how I react to someone else. And so we think about these traits of tenderness. God says what? What happened to the Samaritan? When he saw him, he had compassion on him and went to him and bound up his wounds. So he didn't just see him and said, oh, I feel bad for you. What did he do? Took action, right? He said, I'm going to go bound up your wounds. So as a believer, we're supposed to have a heart that's tender, a heart that doesn't just say, oh man, there's so many bad things in the world. I wish we could do something. What's a believer supposed to do? Find a way to do something. Take action to care for those others. All right, back to Esther, chapter 4. We'll see two ways that Esther was tender in her traits. First off, and this is if you've got your notes, I actually switched these because I just thought it made more sense to switch these because that's how it is in the story. But first off, we see that she cared enough to fast and pray. This is how Esther prepared for the things she had to do. Esther chapter 4 and verse 16. She's talking with Mordecai. And it says in verse 15, and Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer. Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan and fast ye for me. Neither eat nor drink 3 days or night. 3 days, night or day. Sorry. I also and my handmaidens will fast likewise, and I will go unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way, and according to all that Esther had commanded him. So here we have Esther, and what did she command them to do? She said, gather all the Jews together and fast and pray for 3 days. Why did they do that? Why did they fast and pray for 3 days? They were looking for an answer, okay. Well, I'll challenge you a little bit. I think she knew the answer, right? She had already made up her mind what she was going to do. What was she actually asking for? Courage and God's protection, right? She was asking God, look, God, I'm going to go in here. You've already given me the opportunity and the access, at least a chance of an access. But what I'm asking for you, God, is to turn the king's heart. Allow the king to hear my request. And so she says what? If I perish, I perish. Her mind was made up. She knew what she was called to do, but she was asking God to fulfill that, right? It says, and fast for me, neither eat or drink nor 5 days, and I will likewise. The idea, and we talk about this book is Esther, the one, it's hard not to teach Esther and never mention that God is not mentioned in this, right? But we see his fingerprints all throughout. We see the mold, we see his hands on the clay. This is where we see her praying and fasting. And when we fast and pray, and we don't typically do this. I mean, we do sometimes, but it's not something I know certain faith teachings or certain groups will do this regularly, but we don't do this or teach this regularly. But when we fast and pray, what do? What's our focus? Why do we fast and pray? Get a hold of God. And how do we do that? We're actually getting rid of ourselves, right? When we fast and praying, what are we denying ourselves? The things we want, right? To listen to what God really wants for us. And so we think about this idea of fasting and praying. I think of Isaiah 58, and we won't have to turn there. I've put most of it up here. We won't read the whole thing. We've studied this, I think, last summer about Isaiah 58. What is the fast that God requires of us? He says there. So remember the Israelites, they were fasting. He says, you're religious people. Y'all are doing, you're seeking after my heart. You're doing those things that you're trying to follow the law. He's like, but when you fast, you're fasting because you want to get something. You're fasting because you want to see something happen. He's like, but what should happen when you fast? What's he saying in Isaiah 58? Is not this the fast that I have chosen, to loose the bands of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and let the oppressed go free, and you break every yoke? Is it not to deal the bread to the hungry, and that thou bring the poor that are cast out to thy house? And when thou seest the naked, that thou cover him, and when thou hide not thyself from thine own flesh? Then shall thy light break forth as the morning, and thine health shall spring forth speedily, and thy righteousness shall go before thee. The glory of the Lord shall be thy reward. The idea here is that when we fast and pray, what we're really doing is we're looking at our own hearts. We're saying, God, where's those things that I'm holding back? Where's those things that I'm focused on me about? Because what's it say here? Is anything about that list about me? Not until you get to the very end. And what's he say there? That thou hide not thine own flesh. We talked about this when we taught this last time. This is the idea. I'm going to give you the shirt off my own back. I'm not worried about being humiliated, but I'm worried about caring about others. The idea that as believers, he says it's interesting. You're fasting, right, during this time? Like that's what he's talking about. You're fasting. You're giving up things. But in the middle of that, it says, is it not to deal thy bread to the hungry? That bread that you're not eating because you're fasting, go give it to somebody else. Don't just save it so you can have a nice feast when you're done fasting. What he's talking about there is believers, our hearts have to change. We have to focus. We got a time of fasting and praying is looking and saying, God, what am I holding back? Where are the things that I'm doing wrong to people? Where are the wrong ideas and the wrong philosophies that I have? Let me focus them on you. Let me search your scriptures. Let me understand and let me act. And let me show your love in action. And then what he said, what happens if we do that? Our light will break forth as the morning. It says, and thine health shall spring forth speedily. The idea that is, if we have our hearts focused on others, on a tenderness, on caring for others so much that we're fasting and praying and we're caring, what's going to happen? We're going to see revival. That's what he's talking about there. He says we're going to see revival. We're in a time of pandemic. We talked about this before. It's very lonely sometimes in a time of pandemic, right? None of us have really, we talk about unprecedented, none of us have experienced a stay-at-home order like this. A hurricane comes, we stay at home for 24, 48 hours, we're done, right? We're back out. We're out walking the neighborhood, checking on things, that kind of thing. This has been months that we've been isolated. But what does God say? This is not time to not be caring for others. This is a time to be caring for others, showing forth our love and care for others so that we will see God's revival through this. We see that she fasted and prayed. We also see that she cared enough to speak. Turn back to Esther chapter 4. Esther chapter 4. For if all together, and this is the Mordecai speaking unto Esther and telling her, this is the challenge we're in. It says, for all together, if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knowest whether thou art come to the kingdom for such time as this? What does Mordecai tell her? God's will is going to be done whether you do this or not. God's will doesn't depend on you, Esther. Because what's he say there? If you don't do this, if you hold your peace, their deliverance will come from somewhere else. But it's going to impact you. You're going to miss out on that blessing. You're going to miss out on that salvation. Because what it says there, what's going to happen? Thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. See, Mordecai was putting it in perspective. He was saying, Esther, this isn't about you. Then that's where we think of how Esther got to that point where she says, if I perish, I perish. Because she knew that if she didn't do God's will, what's going to happen? It's over for her anyways. So if she just stays quiet, it's failure. But if she does what God says, she may lose her own life for that. But at least she was doing God's will. When we think about this idea of Paul, what did Paul say? Paul went out and he was like, my life is but dung. He says, I count all these good things that I do for nothing. He says, but that I may know him and the power of his resurrection. The idea that is if I go forward, it's not about me, it's about Christ, and it's moving the gospel forward. So as Mordecai told her, it says it's time for you to speak because who knows that you're put in this kingdom for such a time as this. We're put in place in a certain place for a reason. I believe in God's providence in our individual lives. He works in our individual lives and puts us in place for a reason to do the right thing, to do the thing that to speak to the folks, to witness, to testify. He puts us in the place. We look at Philip, the evangelist. Where was Philip? Philip was walking along, and then here came this Ethiopian that was reading. God put Philip in that place to be a testimony to that Ethiopian, to share the gospel with him. And so we think about this idea, for such a time as this, are we, and as Pastor Monteith spoke a few weeks ago, are we using our time? Are we taking advantage of the time and realizing that it's not to wait until the pandemic is over to go start spreading the gospel? It's not or to start loving our neighbors or showing care to our neighbors once we can actually interact. Or I've got to wait till I can hug somebody again before I can show love. No, what's he say? Such a time as this. Now is the time to start doing that. Now is the time to start doing the work of God. Esther chapter 8, we see that Esther spake. Esther spake. In chapter 8 and verse 3, and Esther spake yet again before the king, and fell down at his feet, and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite, and his device which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter towards Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king. So here we see Esther's courage, that she goes, and she didn't just say, I'm going to go in and then change your mind. Well, let me see if there's a different way. Let me see if there's God, you told me I need to go in and speak. You gave me you used Mordecai to show me that it's got to be up to me. I'm the one in the right place to do this. But God, maybe I can get Mordecai to do it because he's already sitting in the gate. Maybe he could do it. He's old. If the king lets him perish, it doesn't matter so much. No, Esther said, this is my role. I've got to do this. And Esther went in and she spoke. And what happened? God had placed Esther in the right spot for all those times so that the king did what? He held out his golden scepter, and Esther arose and stood before the king. And she told him of the plot and told him that she said, look, if this happens, in verse 5, it says, if it please the king and I found favor in the sight, the thing seem right before the king, and I be pleased in his eyes, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews, which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come unto my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? Basically, Esther says, look, king, if this order goes through, you're killing me and all of my people. And God had put Esther in a place to win the king's heart. So that the king had a love for Esther that he says, we can't let this happen. And he reversed the order. And he didn't reverse it, but he allowed the Jews to fight back so that they could defend themselves. But the idea that as Esther, she spoke. Because she spoke, God blessed. God moved her heart. We think about speaking up, the times that we need to speak up as believers. And the first is with the gospel. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 14 and 15. But if ye suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are ye, and be not afraid of the terror, neither be troubled. But sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and be ready to give an answer to every man that asketh you the reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. The idea is, believers, we need to be ready to share the gospel. We need to be ready at any time to give the gospel for someone they ask the reason of the hope. Some of us will say, well, nobody's asked me lately, so I'm not ready to give it to them. Is that what this says here? No, we need to be ready. He says it with meekness and fear. Does that mean I need to be in somebody's face saying, you need to get saved because no, it's with meekness and fear. We need to share this because souls are at stake. Like eternal salvation is at stake. He says what? We need to be ready to share that for every man that asketh the reason of our hope. There's a reason why they would ask us, right? Why would that be? Why do you think they might ask us? Hopefully. Because they should be seeing Christ in us. We should be seeing the light that Christ has given us. So they should be asking. So as believers, we should be ready to speak. We also see in Psalms chapter 31, open thy mouth. And this is actually in the instruction to the king from King Lemuel. It says, open thy mouth for the dumb and of the cause for which such are appointed to destruction. Open thy mouth, judge righteously, and plead the cause of the poor and needy. The idea is, believers, we need to be the ones that can speak up for those that can't, for those that don't have the opportunity. Show mercy to those that can. He says that the idea, the cause of all such are appointed in destruction, those that have no other opportunity, no chance, no, that are destitute is probably the word that I would think of when I think of that there. The idea, we need to judge righteously and plead the cause of the poor and needy. We have a role. We need to care for others. We need to see those that are struggling. I shared this picture. This was a teenager last year in Baltimore. He was on a bus ride home from school, and he got off the bus because he saw this guy laying on the side. He'd been listening to some gospel music, got off, and went down and prayed for him. And actually, a police officer took a picture of this young man praying for this homeless guy on the street. He says, in an interview later, he says, I don't know what was up with the guy, if he was sick, if he was unwell. I just knew that God needed me to pray over him. And so he went down and prayed over him. And actually the bus waited for him, and he got back on. But the idea as believers, do we care for the poor and needy? Do we have a heart for folks? Not just to say, be blessed and go forward, but actually care for someone, to take time out of our day. It's easy when I think of I was thinking of being in exile. It's easy to care for folks that you know in your own neighborhood, or you may know in your own street. Ever been on a trip and seen somebody pulled over and stop and actually offer to help when you're out of your comfort zone, when you're out of a place? I don't recommend people do that just on a regular basis, but in the right situation, you should, and care for others. That's where this young man saw that. He saw the need, that this guy needed something, and he didn't have much to give, but he could pray. And so he offered prayer. The idea of Isaiah chapter 1 and verse 17, learn to do well, seek judgment, relieve the oppressed, judge the fatherless, plead for the widow. The idea that we need to be speaking up for those that can't. Why do you think the New Testament church, the deacons were told to care for, or were told what is pure religion, but to care for the widows and the fatherless? Why? Because it's important, because God cares for them, right? God wants us to care for them, to care for those that don't have the opportunities. All right, lastly, we'll bring this home in the last 5 minutes. We've got it, or last 2 minutes. We see that there's a triumphant testimony. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 16 comes to mind. It says, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. I remember we were taking a trip to Mexico on a mission trip, and we took the bus from here down through Texas and everything. We're going down the middle of, in between the Sierra Madres, I think it is, then the mountains in the middle of nowhere in Mexico, and the bus had a brake issue. And so we pulled over on the side of the road. I think it was the brakes were smoking and stuff. And so middle of the night, so we all get out of the bus. Well, it's pitch black. There's no street lights. There's no nothing. And we're standing here, and you can barely see, because of the stars, the outline of the mountains. But you know what you could see? You could see houses. You could see a light in the distance. And you imagine as believers, that's where we are. We're in a world of darkness. But we're that light in the distance, that comfort, that opportunity. If we had to go somewhere, we knew where to go because there was a light in the distance. So as believers, we need to let our light shine. Esther. And so we see Esther, and they, in chapter 7, verse 10, so they hanged Haman on the gallows, and that they had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. We see that the king's wrath was against Haman for what he had promised to do to the Jews. And so he hung hung Haman on the gallows that were prepared for Mordecai. Haman had intended to get Mordecai killed. He had built gallows to do it. He had a whole plan in place, real black hat cowboy kind of guy. Had an evil plan in place. And it actually turned out that Haman was the one that faced that judgment. And we see that Esther, in verse 8, verse 3, says, Esther spake again before the king and fell down before his face and besought him with tears. And so we just looked at that, the idea that Esther was glorified through this. Esther was in a place of power, right? God blessed Esther through this for her diligence and working and following him and trusting in him. What was the testimony of Esther? He held out the scepter. She could have died, right? You imagine being one of the few people that have entered with that and that broke that law and had entered and had the scepter hold out. What kind of testimony would that give to Esther from then on? God, there was a miracle. We really want to call it that. That was God's work and the king's heart. We also see Mordecai. Mordecai was put in a place of power. In verse 2 of chapter 8, and it says, and the king took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Here, Mordecai was rewarded. Mordecai became over the house of Haman. And we also look down in verse 15 of chapter 8. It says, and Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold, and with garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. Here was a man who was a judge, who was despised by some of the Persians for him being put in a place of authority, right? Who is this guy, Mordecai, this outsider that's being put in this place of authority? But here we see what happens. By the end of the story, we have Mordecai being celebrated by the people. They saw what Mordecai was, and Mordecai had a heart not just for the Jewish people, but for people, that he cared to do right and to be just. Then lastly, we see the triumph of the people. Look at verse 8, verse 16 and 17. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and every city, wheresoever the king's commandment and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Why did they fear? Did they fear that the Jews were going to revolt and take over the kingdom? No, they saw the work of God. They saw the hand in God in the lives of the Jews, that God had protected them, and there was something different about them. So the people were triumphant in this. We see that testimony went forth, so much so that what did they have? Light and gladness, joy and honor. As believers, do we express that? As a church, are we expressing that? Do we show forth light and gladness and joy and honor? Or are we like, man, this pandemic stuff, we gotta wear masks, we gotta sit so far apart, we can't even hug people. Are we finding joy and honor in this? That God has given us this opportunity to still gather. God has given us the opportunity to still give him glory in all this, that he is still working, that he is still doing great things. We need to be that light and that testimony, because God's going to work through it. I think lastly here, of 1 Peter chapter 2, when I think of the people, 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9 through 10, but ye are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. And why is that? Why did God call us out? That ye should show forth the praises of him who hath called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, which in time past were not a people, but are now a people of God, which had not attained mercy, but now have attained mercy. As believers, we're supposed to be what? Showing forth the praises of him who's called us out of darkness into his marvelous light. We're not supposed to live lives that are defeated. The Jews didn't live lives that were defeated. They celebrated. They celebrated because they saw the hand in God and what he did for them. And so I ask this question again at the end of end of this lesson, as we think about where we're at today and the challenges we face and the uncertainty we face. Are we taking advantage of this, of being here for such a time as this? I mean, this is the time that we should be most active. We should be doing things for the gospel. We should be showing forth who he is and his love and his mercy to others. Or are we worried about ourselves, our own comforts, our own pride, our own place? So I ask that, are we in this kingdom, in 2020, in this pandemic, in this place we're at for such a time as this? Any questions or thoughts as we finish? All right, well, I thank you for your time. Let's close in a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this opportunity to open up your word, and I thank you for the encouragement you've given me, Lord, just to show that this is a time to stand up and speak your gospel, Lord, to preach your gospel and to really share the good news, Lord, that we have, that you've come to save us, Lord, and that salvation is still real today. And just as Esther and the Jews found salvation in the opportunity that came, Lord, and rejoice, Lord, help us be a people that rejoices, that praises you constantly for that salvation, that raises you up, Lord. And I pray that you just that others may see that heart that you've given us, and help us to give you the glory in all that's done through all this time. And I praise you for this time together. I pray for the services coming up. Just, Lord, please have your hand upon us. Help us to really be a people that sees your word go forward, Lord. Help us use us as vessels to do that. We thank you for the time together. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.